Before the light, there was only silence, and in that silence, the soul whispered truths that no one wanted. This story is not for those who seek comfort. It's for those who feel something is wrong behind the smiles, for those who sense that beneath kindness, a shadow waits to be seen. Jung once said that the mask we wear too long becomes our face. What if the smiles we trust most are not windows to peace, but veils that hide what we refuse to confront? As you listen, don't rush to agree or deny. Just let the words echo. Somewhere inside you already know this story. It has been living beneath your own smile all along. Take a breath, step into the quiet, and dare to see what hides behind the light. It begins in silence, the kind that hums beneath the fluorescent light of a hospital corridor or in the quiet room after a long argument. You meet someone's eyes and they smile, not too wide, not too tight, just enough to suggest warmth. And yet, something in that smile feels wrong. It lingers like a perfume you can't identify, pleasant but slightly off. Jung once warned that what hides behind a smile can be more dangerous than open hostility, for the mask of joy is often the final defense of a soul at war with its. We live in a culture addicted to smiling. Corporate portraits, family photos, online profiles, each image rehearsed, perfected, sterilized. The world no longer allows the raw face of sorrow or confusion. We are taught to polish it, to smile through it, to wear the sun even when we are drowning in night. And this, Jung would say, is where the shadow begins its feat, because every smile that denies pain becomes an offering to the unconscious, and what we repress does not disappear. It waits. In Jung's clinic, there was a woman everyone described as radiant, her voice soft, her posture impeccable, her laughter musical. She would greet the nurses with gifts, bring flowers to other patients, and insist that life was beautiful even when her own heart was fractured. But Jung saw it instant, the subtle stiffness in her eyes, the way her laughter arrived half a second too, the tremor in her hand as she fitted her coat. When he asked her why she smiled so much, she paused. Then she said something chilling. "If I stop smiling, I think I might disappear." That sentence haunted Jung for years because it revealed a truth about human nature that most prefer not to. We often construct our personalities not to express who we are, but to protect ourselves from annihilation. The smile becomes armor, a delicate barricade against chaos, rejection, or the unbearable weight of our own authenticity. But behind that armor, pressure builds. The psyche begins to suffocate beneath the performance. The unconscious scratches at the walls, whispering in dreams, seeping into gestures, sabotaging relationships, until one day the mask cracks. Modern neuroscience has found that fake smiling activates regions of the brain associated with stress rather than joy. The forced grin sends contradictory signals to the amygdala, the emotional center, which begins to associate social interaction with threat. It's as if the body itself knows the deceit and starts to rebel against it. The more we pretend to be fine, the more the nervous system becomes trapped in tension, confusion, and chronic exhaustion. Jung intuited this long before science proved it. He said that repression is a psychic poison, one that transforms kindness into control, politeness into denial, and smiles into silent scream. Ancient wisdom mirrored the same warning. In Buddhism, the false serenity is considered one of the most insidious delusions, the smile that conceals attachment, resentment, or fear. In Christian mysticism, the devil is often described not as a monster, but as a being who hides behind light, whose calm expression seduces the soul into comfort or devouring it. The Greeks told of Narcissus, whose beauty reflected not truth, but illusion. His smile was the surface of the pond, where he drowned in his own image. Those who hide behind the smile are not always evil. Most are simply terrified of being seen, of being judged, of being unloved in their raw state. Their cheerfulness is a shield against vulnerability. But the tragedy is that it also blocks intimacy. Because if you never reveal your pain, no one can ever truly reach you. The smile becomes a prison, the glass wall between self and world. And every day you reinforce it, you lose a little more of your reality. Jung described this as the tyranny of the persona, the mask we create to interact with society. The persona is necessary. It allows us to function, to communicate, to belong. But when the mask fuses to the face, when the smile becomes the skin itself, the inner life decays. The shadow grows powerful, lurking beneath that perfect grin, feeding on the suppressed tears and silenced anger. Then one day it erupts. Sometimes in illness, sometimes in cruelty, sometimes in a quiet breakdown that no one understands because until that day, you were the happiest person they knew. Imagine a mirror slowly fogging over. The reflection fades, the features blur, and yet the smile remains fixed. That is the danger Jung spoke of, the moment when the self disappears but the performance continues. The person becomes a ghost within their own life, smiling on autopilot, applauded for their grace, while their soul starves unseen. And so Jung's warning was not against smiling itself, but against the lie of it, against the compulsion to appear happy at all costs, because beneath that compulsion lies the greatest fear of all, the fear of facing what the smile hides. And if we cannot face our shadow, then our shadow will fade in dreams, in symptoms, in the quiet moments when the mask. The dangerous smile is not a gesture, it's a disguise for despair. And when a society begins to value the mask more than the truth, it breeds a collective psychosis of artificial harmony, a world where everyone is fine, and yet no one feels. As Jung once wrote, a man who cannot confront his own darkness will project it upon the world. The smile becomes the stage curtain behind which that projects. Behind it, guilt festers, resentment ferments, and the unacknowledged pain of millions accumulates like fog. You can feel it in offices, in families, in the mirror. There's a reason horror films so often use the image of a smiling. It's a symbol of the uncanny, of something human turned inhuman by repression. The smile that doesn't reach the eyes is the soul's warning sign. It says, something sacred is being hidden, something is dying behind the performance. And so, when you meet a smile that feels too perfect, too constant, too rehearsed, pause. Don't admire it, listen to it. Because sometimes the most dangerous monsters are not the ones who scowl, but the ones who smile, so you'll never look deeper. Jung would tell you this: the truth will find its way through the cracks, and when it does, the smile will fade, the shadow will, and the soul, long imprisoned behind politeness, will finally breathe. It always begins with warmth, soft tone, the reassuring eyes, the small acts of concern that make you feel safe. The kind person, the one who never raises their voice, who always says the right thing. They listen, they comfort, they smile. But Jung knew that behind excessive kindness often hides something unsettling, a psychological strategy of control. The mask of goodness can become the most efficient disguise for the shadow, because nothing blinds the world faster than a smile drenched in virtue. Jung wrote that the brighter the light, the darker the shadow. The people who radiate relentless positivity often cast the longest darkness behind them. Their empathy is rehearsed, their compassion mechanical. You notice it when their comfort feels strangely hollow, when they repeat soothing words that never quite reach you. They appear calm, but the calm is not peace. It's a suppression so deep that even they can't hear the screams beneath it. The mask of kindness is a masterpiece of repression, designed to convince both others and oneself that the inner storm has been conquered. In one of Jung's sessions, there was a man named Friedrich. Everyone at the clinic adored him. He volunteered to help other patients, brought books, prayed for the sick, but Jung saw through him almost immediately. There was something obsessive about Friedrich's goodness, a moral rigidity that left no room for imperfection. During analysis, Jung asked him about his anger. Friedrich laughed, almost offended. Anger? No, doctor. I forgave the world long ago. Yet when Jung mentioned his father, his hand clenched so hard that his knuckles went white. The room grew cold. Weeks later, Friedrich confessed something he'd never told anyone, that as a child, he had watched his mother beaten by his father, powerless, trembling, in silence. And from that moment he had vowed to be the opposite of him, to never hurt anyone, to never show rage, to be pure goodness. But that vow had become his curse. He no longer had a self, only an image. He had buried his shadow so deeply that it began leaking through his kindness in distorted ways: passive aggression, emotional guilt, subtle manipulation masked as love. This is the danger Jung warned about, when the desire to be good becomes an unconscious attempt to erase one's darkness, because goodness that denies shadow is no longer virtue, it's vanity. The ego feeds on the performance of benevolence, while the unconscious festers with the truths it refuses to face. The result is a psychological paradox: the person who helps everyone but feels secretly superior to them, the one who forgives yet quietly despises, who smiles but trembles at the thought of being truly seen. Modern psychology has confirmed this duality. Studies in affective neuroscience show that individuals who habitually suppress negative emotions, especially anger, exhibit higher activity in the anterior cingulate cortex, a region linked to cognitive dissonance and self-deception. They are not at peace. They are at war within themselves. Their kindness becomes a behavioral armor reinforced by social reward. Society praises them for being selfless, for never complaining, for always smiling. And so the mask tightens, sealing the truth inside. Religious and mythological traditions recognize this archetype long before. In Christian lore, Lucifer was once the bringer of light, the angel of beauty and intellect, before his pride twisted that light into deceit. The same transformation happens in human souls when their light refuses to coexist with shadow. In Buddhism, it is called spiritual bypassing, using compassion and serenity as tools to avoid pain, rather than integrate it. The Stoics warned against false virtue, the quiet arrogance of those who pretend to be unmoved, as if indifference were enlightenment. Jung called this inflation of goodness a saint complex. The individual identifies so completely with their persona of kindness that they begin to mistake it for their true self. Every unpleasant impulse is projected outward. Anger becomes the world's problem. Lust becomes other people's sin, and envy becomes concern. In this state, the person becomes psychologically untouchable. No shadow may enter the temple of their purity. But the unconscious doesn't vanish, waits, feeding on hypocrisy until one day the saint becomes the serpent. There is a reason many cult leaders, abusers, and manipulators begin as helpers. The same charisma that heals can also control. The same desire to save others can become a mechanism to dominate them. The smile becomes a leash. The soft voice becomes an instrument of guilt. The mask of kindness seduces because it offers safety, but true safety never demands surrender. The false healer asks for your trust while hiding their own infection. Jung described this phenomenon as the wounded healer possessed by his wound. Imagine standing in a forest at night, following a flickering lantern. The light guides you deeper and deeper until you realize it's moving toward a cliff. That is what it feels like to trust the mask of kindness. It glows with sincerity, but it leads to the abyss of dependency, because behind the giver's selflessness often hides a craving for validation, admiration, or control. They need to be needed, and so they create helplessness. The tragedy is that these people are not monsters. They are fragmented souls. Their kindness began as survival, as atonement for pain they could not bear. They smiled to protect themselves from rejection, to earn love, to undo trauma through goodness. But somewhere along the way, the smile stopped being it became a compulsion. And every time they said, "I'm fine," they sank deeper into silence. Jung said that integration requires the courage to be imperfect. True kindness arises not from the denial of darkness, but from the acceptance of it. When you know your capacity for cruelty, your kindness becomes real. When you face your jealousy, your forgiveness gains weight. Without shadow, love becomes sterile performance. The danger lies in pretending that goodness can exist without confronting what threatens. In families, in workplaces, in spiritual communities, the mask of kindness reigns supreme. It keeps the peace at dinner tables, while resentment festers beneath polite smiles. It runs corporations that preach empathy while exploiting exhaustion. It fills social media with hearts and prayers while envy gnaws at the subconscious. It is the mask that humanity wears collectively to avoid seeing it. And yet, Jung would whisper, Beware of the person who never offends, who never disagrees, who never reveals anger, because where there is no shadow, there is no. The mask of kindness, worn too long, turns the face beneath it pale and hollow. It is not love, it is fear wearing a smile. So when someone smiles too perfectly, when their compassion feels rehearsed, when their serenity seems untouched by pain, don't be fooled. Look into the stillness behind their eyes, because there, in the reflection of their perfect kindness, you might glimpse the darkness they are desperate to hide. And perhaps, if you are brave enough, you will recognize it, because you have hidden yours the same way. It happens quietly, a flicker in the eye, a tremor in the voice, a strange emptiness in laughter that once felt sincere. The smile remains, but something behind it has begun to rot. Jung described this moment as the psychic fracture, the point at which the persona, the social mask, can no longer contain the vast and neglected shadow beneath. What once served as protection becomes a cage, and the creature inside, starved and furious, begins to. The abyss beneath the grin is not visible. It hides in gesture, in tone, in the pauses between words. You can feel it when someone laughs a little too loudly, when their generosity feels compulsive, when they seem too eager to prove how happy they are. It is the unconscious beginning to leak through the seams of control. Jung called this the return of the repressed, the soul's rebellion against falseness. Every suppressed emotion, every silenced truth, every buried scream begins to demand recognition. One of Jung's most haunting cases was of a woman named Clara. To everyone around her, she was the embodiment of grace, a mother, a wife, a volunteer at her church. Her friends said her smile could heal a room. But in dreams, Clara saw her own face melting, her teeth falling out, her reflection smiling back at her while whispering, "You're not real." She would wake up drenched in sweat, unable to breathe. When Jung asked her what she felt when she smiled, she said, "Relief, because it keeps them from asking what's wrong." That sentence, Jung wrote, was the doorway to the abyss. Clara's entire identity had been built on repression. As a child, she learned that crying brought punishment, that anger brought shame, that sadness made people uncomfortable. So she smiled. She smiled through pain, through betrayal, through decades of quiet humiliation. But the psyche does not forget. It waits in the dark, like water pressing against the walls of a dam, and when the cracks appear, it rushes in with unstoppable force. Modern psychology has given this collapse a name: emotional dissonance. It is the chronic conflict between what we feel and what we display. Studies on long-term emotional suppression show increased rates of anxiety, memory loss, and even cardiovascular disease. The smile, once a tool of social harmony, becomes a weapon turned inward. The brain begins to confuse survival with deception. It learns that authenticity equals danger, that safety means pretending. Over time, this disconnection becomes unbearable, leading to what Jung called psychic death, the loss of the true self beneath the mask. But the abyss is not simply despair. It is the gateway to truth. Jung believed that beneath every breakdown lies a breakthrough, that the unconscious does not seek to destroy, but to rebalance. The abyss swallows the false persona not out of malice, but out of necessity. It demands surrender. The individual must face the raw, unfiltered chaos they have avoided, the rage, the envy, the grief, the shame. Only then can integration begin. But for most, that confrontation is too terrifying. So they cling to the grin, even as it cracks. There is an ancient image that captures this perfectly: the smiling skull. Found in Aztec, Hindu, and Christian iconography, it represents the paradox of life and death, the grin of decay. The skull smiles because it knows what we deny, that beneath every mask lies the same truth. The grin is eternal, but the flesh that shapes it is temporary. Jung saw this image as symbolic of individuation, the process by which one faces the horror of one's own inner death to emerge whole. To see the abyss beneath the smile is to see one's own mortality stripped of illusion. In myth, this descent has many forms. Orpheus descending into the underworld to find Eurydice, Christ entering the tomb before resurrection, the Buddha confronting Mara beneath. Each story is a variation of the same psychological truth. You must face the darkness within to be reborn into authenticity. The grin that hides pain must eventually become the grimace of transformation. There is no healing without first acknowledging the wound. In modern society, we fear this descent more than death itself. Our culture demands constant performance, constant smiling. Even our grief is curated, our despair filtered through bright captions and hollow affirmations. We are taught that to show darkness is weakness, and so the abyss grows beneath our collective grin, swallowing the depth of our humanity. We call it burnout, depression, anxiety. But these are not random afflictions. They are symptoms of the soul suffocating beneath performance. Jung warned that what we refuse to face individually will erupt collectively. When too many people hide their pain behind smiles, society itself begins to fracture. The collective shadow emerges as violence, fanaticism, corruption, forms of the repressed made visible. Behind every smiling civilization lies a cemetery of forgotten truths. The more a culture preaches happiness, the closer it stands to collapse, because denial, even when decorated with smiles, is a ticking clock. In the silence of his study, Jung once wrote, "People will do anything, no matter how absurd, to avoid facing their own soul." The smile is the most socially acceptable absurdity of all. It allows us to pretend we have conquered suffering while it festers beneath the surface. But there comes a moment, an unguarded second, when the mask slips, perhaps while looking in the mirror, or during an argument, or in a dream that feels too real. You see the abyss staring back. It's not evil. It's simply honest, and once you've seen it, you can never unsee. The abyss beneath the grin is the place where the truth waits. It is terrifying because it asks for everything: your illusions, your defenses, your false peace. But those who dare to face it emerge changed. Their smiles no longer hide pain. They reveal wisdom. Their laughter no longer denies the darkness. It dances with it. Jung believed that only by descending into this abyss can a human being become whole. Because to smile truthfully, one must first know the face that lies beneath the grin, and only those who have walked through their own darkness can smile without deceit. So the next time you smile, pause for a heartbeat. Ask yourself, is it a bridge to others or a wall against yourself? The answer will tell you whether the abyss is beneath you or already inside you. Not every smile is born of kindness. Some are crafted, calculated, sharpened into tools. They are weapons disguised as warmth, instruments of persuasion wielded with surgical precision. Jung warned that when the persona grows too powerful, when the mask becomes more real than the face beneath, it begins to act on its own, independent of the soul that created it. The individual no longer wears the mask wears them, and what begins as protection becomes domination. The smile that controls doesn't shout or threaten, it seduces, it disarms, it builds trust only to bind it. These are the smiles of politicians who promise salvation while tightening chains, of lovers who soothe as they manipulate, of leaders who claim to heal while they feed on submission. To Jung, this was not merely social manipulation, it was a psychic possession. The individual had become a vessel for their own shadow, masquerading as benevolence. In one of Jung's lesser-known case notes, there was a patient named Hannelore, a woman whose smile seemed magnetic. Her presence could calm a room. Her voice made people confess things they had never said aloud. She described herself as a peacekeeper, proud of her ability to dissolve conflict with charm. Yet her relationships were littered with confusion, exhaustion, and quiet resentment. Her husband described her as a sun that never lets anyone rest. When Jung asked her how when people obeyed her, she smiled faintly. Safe. It was in that word that Jung recognized the infection of control hidden beneath her serenity. Hannelore's smile was not kindness, it was armor. It kept her safe by keeping others beneath her influence. Every act of empathy was laced with an unspoken condition: gratitude, dependence, loyalty. She didn't seek connection. She sought control disguised as love. And like all who fear losing power, She hid behind a perpetual smile. Modern psychology calls this pattern covert narcissism, the manipulation of emotion through virtue. It's the performance of humility that masks hunger, the exaggerated empathy that conceals a need for dominance. Research in behavioral psychology shows that such individuals activate reward circuits in the brain when others mirror their emotions. It is not true empathy. It is a form of control through emotional contagion. The smile, in this sense, becomes a remote control for human hearts. The archetype of this phenomenon is ancient. In Greek myth, there was the figure of Eros, not merely the god of love, but of obsession, enchantment, and surrender. His smile enslaved gods and mortals alike. In Hindu lore, it is the Maya, the divine illusion that makes the unreal seem real. In Christian theology, it is the serpent in the garden, soft-voiced, beautiful, promising enlightenment through disobedience. Jung believed that these myths were not about deities, but about psychological forces within every human being. The capacity to charm is not evil, it is power. But power, when unconscious, always turns predatory. There is a moment when the manipulative smile stops being a social tool and becomes a pathology. You can sense it when the person's gaze lingers too long, when their calm feels rehearsed, when their generosity carries an unspoken debt. These individuals often describe their control as care. They tell themselves they are helping, guiding, protecting, but beneath that story lies fear, the fear of being powerless, unseen, unloved. The control is not malice, it's survival. Yet survival, when built on domination, always becomes destruction. In Jung's language, these people are possessed by their persona. The persona, once a bridge between self and world, mutates into a parasite that feeds on validation. Every smile becomes bait, every kindness a transaction. The true self, buried beneath layers of charm, grows weaker with each performance. The irony is cruel. In trying to control others, they lose control of themselves. But the real danger of the controlling smile lies in its effect on others. Victims often describe feeling peaceful but trapped, as if living inside a dream they didn't choose. They find themselves unable to confront or even dislike the manipulator. The charm works like hypnosis. Resistance feels rude, confrontation feels cruel. Jung compared this to the mana personality, a psychological force that radiates authority and seduction simultaneously. Such individuals carry an aura that bends perception, enlightened. Yet, what they radiate is not divinity, but the concentrated power of repression. Science has begun to map this. Studies on micro-expressions show that even subtle asymmetries in smiles, tiny delays, shifts in eye movement, can unconsciously trigger compliance in observers. The brain interprets it as dominance wrapped in warmth, a pattern that once kept tribes unified under a leader. Evolution rewarded the smile that controlled because it maintained order. But in the modern psyche, it breeds codependence and quiet submission. There is a moment in every manipulative dynamic when the victim begins to see through the smile. It's subtle, a flicker of recognition, a sense that the warmth. Jung described this as the awakening of the shadow in the other. Once seen, the spell weakened, but breaking it requires immense courage, because to confront the manipulative smile is to confront one's own longing to be loved, guided, or saved. The manipulator and the victim are two sides of the same psychological coin, one afraid to lose power, the other afraid to face independence. Religious traditions warned us about this dynamic through parable. In the story of the Antichrist, the final deceiver does not appear monstrous, but radiant. His words soothe, his eyes comfort, his smile promises unity. But what he offers is submission disguised as peace. Jung interpreted this myth as a prophecy of the human psyche. The shadow will always come dressed in light. The smile that controls is not confined to individuals, it shapes entire cultures. Corporations smile through marketing campaigns that exploit emotion. Politicians smile as they speak of freedom while tightening surveillance. Even families enforce control through the gentle tyranny of guilt and affection. We have built a civilization where manipulation has become indistinguishable from care. Jung's warning was not moral, but existential. He said, "The greatest danger to humanity is not evil, but the unconscious man doing good. Because when control hides beneath goodness, it justifies anything. It rewrites cruelty as compassion, domination as leadership, obedience as love. To resist such control, one must learn to see through the smile, to recognize the trembling need that hides beneath it. The manipulator is not an enemy, but a mirror reflecting our own fear of helplessness. The moment you stop seeking safety in someone else's smile, the spell breaks. The moment you claim your own authority, their power dissolves. So the next time you are disarmed by a smile that feels too warm, too smooth, too perfect, pause. Ask not what it offers, but what it hides, because the smile that controls feeds on your trust, and once you give it, it will not easily let you go. And Jung would whisper from the shadow, "Beware the light that blinds, for not all brightness is truth." There comes a moment when the mask no longer fits. It stretches, cracks, begins to slip under the weight of everything it has been forced to. The smile that once protected now feels heavy, almost. It trembles at the edges, uncertain of its own existence. Jung described this collapse as enantiodromia, the law of reversal, where any extreme eventually becomes its opposite. What began as control turns to chaos. The light that was meant to guide becomes the fire that burns. The persona collapses, and, with it, the illusion of self that once held the world together. The breakdown often begins in whispers, not screams, a fatigue that no sleep cures, a silence that grows louder each day. The person who once smiled through storms begins to lose interest in pretending. Their laughter fades. Their charm curdles into bitterness. They speak less, or they speak too much. The eyes that once sparkled now seem distant, unfocused, as if they've seen something they can't unsee. That is the moment the unconscious rises from beneath the shadow, demanding recognition. Jung said that the unconscious is not merely a repository of repressed content, but a living entity with its own will. And when it has been denied too long, it erupts. He once told of a patient, a businessman, whose entire life was built on calm authority. He was admired, envied, trusted. His smile was his brand, confident, reassuring, immaculate. Then one morning, while shaving, he looked into the mirror and saw a stranger staring back. "I don't know that man," he told Jung. "He's smiling at me, but I can tell he hates me." What followed was a psychological implosion. Nightmares of suffocation, hallucinations of his own face, laughing the shadows. His smile had become an autonomous being, his shadow mocking him from behind the glass. Jung did not treat such events as madness, but as metamorphosis. The collapse of the mask, he wrote, is not destruction, it is initiation. The psyche dismantles its false architecture so that truth can enter. Yet, to the one experiencing it, it feels like death. Anxiety becomes a constant hum. The boundaries between self and shadow blur. Memories resurface. Forgotten cruelty, unspoken guilt, suppressed rage. The smile can no longer hide it. The persona, once pristine, begins to rot from within. Modern neuroscience sheds light on. Under chronic repression, the brain's limbic system, the seat of emotion, becomes hyperactive, while the prefrontal cortex struggles to maintain order. Eventually, the cognitive mask fractures. Emotions long buried surge forward uncontrollably. Panic attacks, depression, dissociation. These are the physiological signatures of the soul reclaiming its territory. Jung's insight remains prophetic. Until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life, and you will call it fate. In ancient myths, this moment of collapse was depicted as descent into the underworld. In Sumerian legend, the goddess Inanna is stripped of her garments one by one as she descends to meet her shadow sister, Ereshkigal. Each layer removed is a symbol of identity undone. Likewise, the individual losing their mask feels exposed, naked before the truth. The persona falls away, leaving only rawness, uncomfortable, trembling, real. The smile fades, replaced by silence. But that silence, Jung would say, is sacred. There is a reason so many fear authenticity. It demands the death of the image. When the mask collapses, relationships built on illusion crumble, careers lose meaning, friendships fall away. The world that once applauded your smile now turns away, confused by your tears. But this rejection is not punishment, purification. The false alliances dissolve so that genuine connection can emerge. Those who have lived behind the mask will find that the collapse leaves them. Yet in that solitude, something begins to breathe again. The collapse is not clean. It is chaotic, humbling, often cruel. Jung compared it to an alchemical process, the nigredo, or blackening, where the soul disintegrates before being reborn. The old self dies screaming. It clings to the smile, to the reputation, to the illusion of control. But no matter how tightly it holds, the shadow pries its fingers open, the tears come, the rage comes, the truth long denied floods in like a storm that has waited centuries. The individual feels broken, but in truth, this is the first time they have been whole. Science echoes this transformation. Studies on trauma integration show that the collapse of repression, though painful, is often followed by increased neurological coherence. Brain scans reveal new pathways forming between regions previously isolated by defense mechanisms. The psyche reorganizes itself. What feels like destruction is, in biological reality, reassembly. The mask collapses, but behind it, the authentic self begins to neuron by neuron, truth by... There is an image Jung loved, the Ouroboros, the serpent devouring its own tail. It is the symbol of renewal through destruction, the eternal cycle of death and rebirth. The collapse of the mask is the soul eating its own illusion. The persona consumes itself, leaving only essence. Those who survive it emerge quieter, slower, less sure of everything, yet more alive than ever before. Their smile, when it returns, is smaller, almost imperceptible. But this time, it is real. Yet the world rarely welcomes such transformation. Society punishes authenticity. It prefers polished masks to trembling faces. When someone's smile disappears, others become uncomfortable, even hostile. They call it depression, midlife crisis, failure. But Jung knew what it truly was. Individuation, the sacred unraveling of falsehood so that the psyche can breathe. He wrote, "In each of us there is another whom we do not know. He speaks to us in dreams and tells us he is real." The collapse of the mask is that moment when the dream voice becomes louder than the social, when you can no longer pretend, when smiling feels like betrayal. It is terrifying, yes, but also liberating, because once the mask has fallen, you can finally see your own face, even if it trembles. So if you find yourself exhausted by pretending, if your smile feels foreign, if silence feels safer than performance, know that you are standing at the edge of that sacred collapse. Do not run from it. Let the mask fall, it shatter. Beneath the ruins, you will find the one who has been waiting, the self that never needed to. And in that quiet recognition, Jung would whisper from the dark, "You were never meant to be perfect. You were meant to be whole." When the mask finally falls, silence fills the space at once occupied. The smile is gone. What stands in its place is something raw, unset, unfiltered. Jung called this emergence the encounter with the shadow, the moment a person meets the parts of themselves they spent a lifetime hiding. The polite face, charming voice, patient gesture, all disintegrate, leaving behind what has always been there: anger, envy, lust, fear, grief, hatred, need. The shadow rises like smoke from the ruins of the persona, and for the first time, the soul begins to speak its true language. To see the shadow is to face the mirror stripped of light. No filters, no poses, no smiles, just the reflection of everything we denied. It is not evil, though it feels that way. It is simply the totality of what we refuse to acknowledge. Jung said, "Everyone carries a shadow, and the less it is embodied in the conscious life, the blacker and denser it is. The shadow becomes monstrous only when ignored. The person who insists they have no darkness becomes its prisoner." He often described the shadow as an ancient being, an instinct older than civilization, an energy that remembers what the ego forgot. In his words, the shadow is the door to the inner world, but it demands blood as the key. That blood is truth. The price of seeing oneself fully is the death of innocence. You realize you are capable of everything you once judged in others. You could lie, you could betray, you could harm. The abyss that terrified you lives inside you. And yet, paradoxically, this revelation is the beginning of moral maturity, because only when you admit your potential for darkness can you truly choose the light. Jung wrote of a patient who dreamed of smiling corpses dancing in a church. Each she knew, friends, colleagues, they smiled, but their eyes were hollow. Beneath their feet, the floor cracked, revealing a pit filled with black water. She tried to run, but one of the corpses grabbed her wrist and whispered, "You belong here." When she woke, she wept Jung interpreted the dream not as a vision of hell. The corpses were the lifeless masks, smiling, empty, soulless. The pit below was her own repressed life force, begging to be seen. The shadow's arrival can feel like possession. Rage erupts where there used to be calm. Desire floods where there used to be restraint. Tears appear without warning. Dreams become violent or erotic. The body shakes as if purging centuries of silence. Jung warned that this is not pathology. It is purification. The psyche vomits the poison of repression, but to those unprepared it feels like insanity. They mistake awakening for collapse. They run back to the mask, terrified the face. Modern psychology now understands what Jung intuited. The shadow corresponds to the limbic system, the primal layer of emotion and instinct that modern life suppresses. Trauma and social conditioning bury it, but it never dies. When reactivated through crisis, loss, or self-inquiry, the suppressed system releases seeds of neurochemicals, adrenaline, cortisol, dopamine, producing the intensity of awakening Jung described. Neuroscientists studying post-traumatic growth have confirmed that confronting these deep emotions can lead to profound reorganization of the brain. The shadow, when faced, becomes medicine. In myth, this encounter is symbolized by the monster at the gate. Gilgamesh facing Humbaba, Perseus confronting Medusa, Christ tempted in the desert, the Buddha facing Mara beneath the tree. The hero must look into the eyes of what terrifies them most and not turn away. Jung believed these stories were not external adventures, but inner map. The dragon guarding the treasure is our own darkness, guarding our own truth. The gold we seek, the soul, the purpose, the peace, lies hidden beneath the creature we fear. But the modern mind avoids dragon. We prefer comfort to confrontation, distraction to dissent. We medicate the shadow, silence it, pathologize it, and so it grows in the dark, feeding on denial until it bursts into the world as chaos. The smiling tyrant, the hypocritical priest, the charismatic manipulator, all are people consumed by shadows. They refuse to. Their charm is not authenticity, but infection. Their smile is the shadow's camouflage. Jung said that integrating the shadow is not about purification, but balance. The goal is not to destroy darkness, but to converse with it, to understand its message. The shadow carries the energy we need to live fully. Anger, when owned, becomes boundary. Fear, when understood, becomes intuition. Desire, when honored, becomes vitality. Every emotion we repress becomes a demon. Every demon we face becomes a guide. Integration is the art of turning monsters into allies. There was a woman Jung treated who had spent her life soft-spoken. In her dreams, she was hunted by wolves. One night, instead of running, she turned and faced. They surrounded her, snarling, teeth bared. But when she reached out her hand, one of the wolves licked her palm. She woke in tears, overwhelmed by a sense of peace she hadn't felt in decades. They weren't trying to kill me, she told Jung. They wanted me to stop pretending I wasn't one of them. That dream, he said, marked the beginning of her individuation. To meet the shadow is to rediscover instinct, to remember that beneath the civilized smile lives an ancient animal that knows how to survive, how to love, how to fight, how to rest. Our culture's obsession with positivity has amputated that instinct. We praise docility, call it virtue, and forget that repression breeds sickness. Jung saw neurosis not as a flaw, but as the shadow knocking on the door, begging to be heard. The shadow behind the smile is not evil. It is unlived life. It is the passion you buried the rage you swallowed to keep the grief you hid to be strong. It is the part of you that still remembers what it feels like to be whole. But it will not come gently. It will shatter the illusion first, and only then, when the ashes, will it whisper. Jung would often end his lectures with a sentence that lingered like a curse. One does not become enlightened by imagining figures of light, but by making the darkness conscious. The smile, he said, is the mask of those who imagine light without facing. But to truly awaken, one must descend. So when your smile fades and your darkness finally speaks, do not silence. Listen. Beneath the growl of the shadow, there is love, the kind that no mask can imitate. And that love, raw and terrible and divine, the beginning of freedom. There is a point where the individual illusion becomes collective, where the private mask grows into a social epidemic. Jung foresaw this long before the term mass psychology existed. He wrote that the greatest danger to civilization is not war or famine, but psychic infection. What begins as one person's fear of authenticity becomes a culture's obsession with pretending. The smile, the once personal defense, mutates into a global symbol of conformity. And when the false smile becomes a social norm, truth itself begins to decay. Walk through any public space and you can feel it. The performance of happiness in cafes, offices, classrooms, churches, smiles everywhere, but few that reach the eye. Even suffering has learned to smile. The depressed post cheerful updates. The lonely take radiant selfies. The exhausted speak in motivational quotes. Jung would say we have entered a collective dream, a shared hallucination of contentment maintained by mutual fear of reality. To question it is to threaten the system. To remove the smile is to become dangerous. The contagion begins innocently. Humans are wired to mimic each other. Mirror neurons fire when we see a face express emotion. A smile triggers one in return. But what happens when those smiles are masked? The mimicry spreads the lie. We imitate what we think is genuine, and soon no one remembers who smiled first or why. The collective shadow grows beneath a culture of enforced positivity. The repression of pain, grief, and doubt becomes institutionalized. Companies call it team spirit. Nations call it patriotism. Religions call it faith. But beneath it lies terror, the terror of falling out of harmony. Jung believed that when a society represses its collective shadow, it creates monsters. The more a culture insists on light, the darker its unconscious. The smiling advertising executive who exploits others, the friendly politician who wages hidden wars, the influencer preaching joy while drowning in despair. They are not anomalies, they are symptoms. The smile has become a mask for structural violence. Behind the aesthetic of well-being lies the machinery of alienation. He compared this phenomenon to the archetype of the trickster, a figure found in every mythology. Loki, Hermes, Coyote, Anansi. The trickster wears a grin that mocks all sincerity, a cosmic jester who thrives on deception. In modern civilization, the trickster has taken digital form. The screen smiles at us from every device, promising connection while harvesting loneliness. The smiley emoji, omnipresent and harmless, is the modern sigil of denial, a command to keep it light, while everything collapses beneath. Jung would have seen this as the collective persona devouring individuality. Science confirms that emotional contagion is real. Experiments at Yale and Harvard have shown that moods, facial expressions, even stress hormones spread through social networks like viruses. A single inauthentic smile can ripple through hundreds of lives. The facade becomes the fabric of society. Authentic emotion, on the other hand, is quarantined. Grief makes people uncomfortable. Anger is labeled toxic. Vulnerability is rebranded as weakness. The result is a civilization addicted to repression. History repeats this cycle. In Rome, during its final century, citizens were obsessed with entertainment, spectacle, and cheer. Bread and circuses kept the people smiling while the empire rotted from within. In pre-revolutionary France, nobility danced through masquerade balls while famine spread outside the palace gates. Jung called this psychic inflation, the collective version of the individual mask. The larger the performance, the closer the fall. He wrote, "What the individual refuses to face, history will force upon him as fate." The contagion of smiles thrives because it feels safe. A smiling society rarely revolts. It consumes instead. It scrolls, purchases, posts. It calls despair burnout and medicates. It calls alienation freedom and celebrates it. But Jung knew that beneath this anesthetized cheerfulness lurks a deep hunger, a collective yearning for authenticity. The more the culture smiles, the more violent its unconscious eruptions become. Wars, scandals, addictions, suicides, these are not failures of progress. They are messages. Ancient traditions understood that societies, like individuals, must confront their darkness or be devoured by it. In tribal rituals, communities reenacted death and rebirth through masks, not to hide, but to reveal. The shaman wore the face of the ancestor or demon to remind the tribe of what they denied. Jung believed modern humanity lost this sacred theater. We still wear masks, but we no longer know why. Our rituals, concerts, politics, media have become performances of forgetfulness. The smiling faces on screens are our new idols, and every click is a prayer to illusion. He warned that a collective that refuses to acknowledge its shadow will unconsciously create leaders who embody it. The smiling demagogue, the charming dictator, the benevolent oppressor, they arise not in spite of our culture's positivity, but because of it. They are the shadow's mouthpiece. The people do not elect them by reason, they summon them by repression. When truth is forbidden, lies become sacred. The collective smile becomes the seal of silence. And yet, there is hope in awareness. Jung said that if enough individuals become conscious of their own shadow, the collective can heal. The contagion can be reversed. A single authentic act of expression, a tear shed without shame, a truth spoken without performance, sends ripples in the opposite direction. Authenticity, too, is contagious. When one person dares to live without the mask, others feel permission to do the same. The collective begins to awaken, one honest face at a time, but the path is perilous. To remove the smile in a world that worships it is to become an exile. The truth-teller will be called bitter, cynical, even mad. Jung accepted this as the cost of consciousness. There is no coming to consciousness without pain, he wrote. People will do anything to avoid their soul, yet whoever looks into their shadow sees not monsters, but men. The contagion of smiles is not. It thrives on imitation, but it dies in presence. When you look at another human being and truly see them, not as a mirror, but as a soul, the illusion falters. The false smile dissolves, and something ancient stirs in its place. Recognition. To heal a world addicted to smiling, we must relearn how to feel. To grieve openly, to rage honestly, to love without performance. Jung's message was simple, though terrifying. Collective healing begins where pretense ends. The day humanity stops smiling to hide, it will finally see itself again. So the next time you walk among smiling crowds, remember, behind every grin may lie a ghost, and perhaps behind your own as well. The question is not whether the infection exists. It is whether you will keep spreading it or be the one who stops. There comes a moment after the forced smile fades when words no longer work. The laughter stops echoing, the noise of performance dissolves, and what remains is silence. Not the peaceful kind, but the kind that hums beneath the skin, the kind that feels alive. Jung called this the night sea journey, the descent into the unconscious, where the soul, stripped of illusion, must navigate darkness without maps or companions. It is the aftermath of the mask's fall, when society's noise no longer numbs, and the individual begins to hear what was always there, the sound of the self-breathing beneath the wreckage. This silence is terrifying because it removes the distractions that kept the psyche safe. Without the smiles, without the roles, there is nothing behind. The person finds themselves face to face with the void that all their noise was built to drown out. Jung wrote that this void is not emptiness. It is potential, the raw field of being before thought or identity. But before it reveals creation, it demands annihilation. Everything false must die in it. Every comforting lie, every borrowed belief, every smile that ever served as armor, the silence devours them. He compared it to the alchemical stage of negrito, the blackening. It is the psychological death where the soul is dissolved into chaos so that something real may emerge. The silence acts as acid, burning away the ego's illusions. Time loses meaning. Days feel hollow. People who used to feel familiar seem distant. Even language feels fragile, inadequate to describe the immensity of what is felt, but cannot be named. Jung wrote, "The soul would rather suffer anything than be nothing. Yet, to be reborn, it must first consent to nothing." Many of his patients feared this silence. They mistook it for depression, when in truth it was initiation. They wanted noise, therapy, affirmation, distraction to fill the space. But Jung urged them to wait, to endure, to listen, because in the stillness something begins to stir. The unconscious, once chaotic, begins to speak, not in words but in symbols, dreams, sensations. The psyche, no longer repressed, starts to reorganize itself. The silence becomes the womb of rebirth. In one of Jung's notes, he described a patient who had stopped speaking entirely for 3 months. She sat in his office, staring out the window. Friends thought it was broken, lost. But Jung understood. He wrote, "She was not sick. She was listening to something. When she finally spoke, her first words were, 'It's quieter inside me now.' That sentence," he said, "was worth more than any cure." The descent into silence is echoed in myth. It is Jonah in the belly of the whale, Christ in the tomb, Buddha beneath the Osiris dismembered and awaiting resurrection. Every story of transformation contains a period of stillness, a burial before renewal. The world calls it failure. The soul calls it gestation. Silence is the crucible where fragments melt into wholeness. But most flee before the process completes. They panic at the stillness and rebuild the mask too soon. And so, the cycle repeats. Modern science has begun to map this descent in neurological terms. Brain scans of long-term meditators and trauma survivors show similar patterns during deep silence. The default mode network, the seat of ego and self-reference, temporarily deactivates. The sense of I dissolves. What remains is pure awareness, beyond narrative, beyond smile or frown. This state, though disorienting, is the biological correlate of Jung's psychology. The silence, it turns out, is not void. It's the reset of consciousness itself. And yet, in our modern world, silence has become the rarest commodity. Every moment is filled with noise, news, notifications, opinions, laughter tracks, background music. The collective cannot bear stillness because it mirrors the individual's fear of self. Jung wrote that when noise dominates, the gods go silent. In our age, that silence has become total. We mistake the absence of divinity for progress, when in truth, it is the result of our refusal to. But for those who endure the descent, the silence transforms. What once felt suffocating becomes sacred. Within it, one begins to perceive the subtle hum of life beyond persona. Birdsong, breath, heartbeat, wind. These were always there, but drowned beneath performance. The silence teaches a new kind of hearing, one that listens from within. Jung said that this is where the self, the totality of being, makes itself known. It doesn't shout, it whispers, and only in silence can it be heard. There is a danger, however, even in this stage. The seeker who discovers peace in silence may become attached to, mistaking withdrawal for enlightenment. Jung warned that integration is not isolation. One must not remain in the underworld. The treasure must be brought back to the light. The purpose of silence is not escape. It is preparation. The individual must return to the world not to perform again, but to live truthfully within it. The real smile, reborn from shadow, belongs to those who have faced the void and returned with eyes. In religious imagery, this rebirth is symbolized by dawn. After the long night, light returns, but softer, humbler. The sun no longer blinds, it reveals. The one who emerges from silence carries something different in their gaze, a stillness that no noise can disturb. They no longer need to smile. Their very presence emanates. Jung described such individuals as centers of calm in the storm of collective madness. They are rare, but when you meet them, you feel it. The absence of performance, the quiet truth of being. So the descent into silence is not an ending, but a passage. The path through which the smile's illusion dies and authenticity is born. The silence strips, dismantles, humbles, and in doing so, gives back what the mask stole, the capacity to feel, to love, to live without disguise. And Jung would say to those trembling in the corner, do not fear the silence. It is not your enemy. It is the echo of your own soul calling you. After the silence, there is a trembling moment when something stirs within, a quiet light, fragile yet unwavering. It does not arrive as joy, not yet. A calm awareness survived the storm. Jung called this the reemergence of the self, the union of opposites after the war between mask. It is not the old smile that returns, but a new one, smaller, slower, radiant in its simplicity. It no longer seeks approval. It does not hide pain. It exists because the soul, having faced the abyss, now knows it can endure. This is the authentic smile, born not from denial, but from understanding. It carries the memory of darkness in its life. There is no perfection in performance. It says, I have been broken, I still breathe. Jung described such a state as individuation, the reconciliation of consciousness with the unconscious, the acceptance of the full spectrum of human nature. It is the moment the fragmented psyche recognizes itself as whole. He once wrote about a woman who came to him after years of analysis. She said, I no longer dream of drowning. When he asked how she felt, she smiled, just barely, and said, It's strange, doctor. I'm not happy. That, Jung said, is the truest form of peace, the serenity that emerges not from avoiding pain, but from integrating it. The smile she wore that day was not decoration. It was testimony. Modern psychology mirrors this transformation. Studies on post-traumatic growth show that individuals who have faced profound darkness often emerge with deeper empathy, resilience, and purpose. Their expressions, researchers note, change subtly. The muscles relax, the eyes. The smile appears less frequent but more genuine, accompanied by congruent signals from the parasympathetic nervous system. The body, once tense from repression, learns to rest again. In neurobiological terms, the authentic smile is the physical manifestation of coherence between heart and mind. In spiritual traditions, this return is always symbolized by light reappearing after descent. The Buddha smiles beneath the Bodhi tree, not because suffering has vanished, but because he understands it. Christ resurrects with wounds still visible. Osiris is reassembled, but never the same. In each story, the hero does not erase the darkness, they carry it as wisdom. The authentic smile is the scar turned sacred. For Jung, the smile's return marked the transformation of shadow into ally. The person no longer fights their darkness, but walks. They can feel anger without cruelty, grief without despair, love without illusion. Their smile no longer hides, it reveals. It tells the world, I contain multitudes, and I am unafraid of them. This, he believed, was the true moral act, not pretending to be good, but integrating one's capacity for both creation and destruction. The authentic smile changes everything around. It does not infect, like it awakens. Others feel safer in its presence because it carries no agenda. It does not demand you be. It invites you. Jung said that such individuals radiate a kind of healing that is not taught, but remembered, an ancient resonance. The psyche, having reconciled its opposite, emits coherence. People near them often describe feeling grounded, calm, seen. This is not charisma. It is integration made visible. There's a story Jung loved to tell of a monk who smiled while sweeping the monastery floor. When asked why, he said, Because I have finally stopped trying to be holy. That, Jung would say, is enlightenment stripped of ego, the smile of one who has ceased to perform goodness and has instead become whole. But this authenticity is fragile. The world, still addicted to masks, will test it. Society will demand the old smile, the polite performance, and yet the one who has descended into silence can no longer return to the charade. They may still smile, but never to please. They smile when truth moves through them. Sometimes that truth is joy. Sometimes it is sorrow, but always it is real. In the collective sense, the return of authentic smiles could signal healing on a larger scale. Imagine a culture where people no longer hide behind happiness, where vulnerability is strength, and honesty is grace. Jung believed that individual integration ripples outward. The individual is the world, he wrote. When one man becomes whole, 1,000 others are freed. The authentic smile, then, is not just personal, it's revolutionary. It restores sanity to a species lost in performance. You can recognize it immediately. The smile that has walked through fire. It doesn't flash, doesn't seek, it simply is. It comes from eyes that have wept, from lips that have trembled, from a soul that returned from the underworld can no longer believe. It is the smile of one who has looked into their own abyss and found it with meaning, is quiet, almost shy. It's the curve of surrender, the expression of someone who no longer fears contradiction. It speaks of the harmony between laughter and tears, between shadow and light. It reminds the observer that peace is not the absence of darkness, but the friendship with it. Jung once wrote, "There is no coming to consciousness without pain, but once one has seen their own darkness, the light no longer terrifies." The authentic smile is the embodiment of that sentence. It is the face of someone who no longer runs from themselves. So when you see such a smile, pause. It may not dazzle, it may not seduce, but it will reach you somewhere words cannot, because it carries truth. The one thing, the false smile, and if you ever find it on your own face, unforced, unexpected, arising from a quiet moment, when the world no longer demands anything, then know this, you have met walked through silence and emerged. Jung would have said it softly, as if to himself, the smile that once hid the soul now reveals it. Every revelation carries its shadow. Even after the descent, even after the authentic smile is born, the darkness does not vanish. Jung warned that enlightenment itself can become the newest mask, that the ego, cunning and tireless, will try to claim even awakening as its trophy. He called this the second possession. When the conscious mind begins to believe it has conquered and when that happens, the smile, pure, humble, alive, can once again harden into an image. The cycle begins anew, only deeper, more seductive, more spiritual. It starts subtly. The person who has faced their shadow begins to speak of peace with pride. Their authenticity becomes performance. Their stillness becomes display. They smile, not to hide pain now, but to prove they have transcended it. The spiritualized ego wears a holier grin, serene, knowing, untouchable. Jung said that this form of inflation is more dangerous than ignorance because it masquerades as wisdom. The greatest illusion, he wrote, is thinking one has none. In his later years, Jung encountered this often among mystics, analysts, and those who had tasted awakening. They spoke of integration. Their eyes betrayed hunger, the need to be admired for depth, for serenity, for enlightenment. He called it the shadow of light, the darkness that grows behind the illusion of purity. The new smile gleams brighter, but it no longer feels alive. It freezes the face again. The cycle has completed its cruel circle. There was once a patient, a philosopher, who claimed to have transcended all conflict. He smiled through every session, speaking of the unity of the harmony of all things. But when Jung asked about his wife, the man's expression flickered. "She doesn't understand my peace. She lives too emotionally." Jung leaned forward and replied, "Then it is not peace you've found, but anesthesia." That silence that followed was heavier than any argument. The man's smile trembled, then cracked, revealing what hid beneath: loneliness, superiority, and unacknowledged rage. The philosopher's serenity was simply another disguise. This is the danger of every awakening, that the mind will rush to reframe truth into identity. I am healed. I am awake. I have integrated my shadow. Each phrase, if repeated long enough, becomes a mask. The ego does not die easily. It survives even the underworld. It re-emerges dressed in white robes, speaking of compassion while craving recognition. Jung saw this in religious figures, in gurus, in ordinary people who mistake calm for wholeness. The false smile of enlightenment is the final trick of the psyche. It feeds not on fear, but on pride. Modern psychology recognizes this as spiritual bypassing. It is the use of growth language to avoid continued confrontation with pain. The person who claims to have found peace may still be fleeing their own humanity. Neuroscientists studying moral superiority note that the same brain circuits activated by addiction light up when a person feels righteous certainty. In other words, even virtue can intoxicate. The smile of purity releases dopamine too. The self congratulates itself for escaping the dark, unaware that denial has simply changed costume. Jung connected this to an ancient symbol. the Ouroboros devouring its tail. Consciousness consumes itself when it forgets humility. The moment the smile becomes proof of enlightenment, it ceases to be authentic. The real smile asks for nothing. The false one demands acknowledgement. The authentic smile flows from presence. The false one grows from pride. And so the cycle of light and shadow continues, each generation building new temples to illusion while believing they've destroyed the old one. He saw this not only in individuals, but in civilization. Cultures that awaken from one tyranny inevitably build another, this time smiling, enlightened, benevolent. Empires of peace, religions of compassion, movements of unity, all beginning in sincerity, ending in dogma. The same pattern repeats. Truth becomes ideology, humility becomes superiority, authenticity becomes performance. The collective smile returns, this time claiming to be holy. And as before, the shadow waits. To Jung, the only antidote to this eternal recurrence was vigilance and awareness. He said, "One does not become enlightened once and for all, but must renew consciousness daily. The smile must be questioned, even the genuine. Each day the self must ask, am I expressing truth or protecting it? Am I smiling from presence or from fear of losing it?" The moment the answer fades, the mask reforms. He often described the ego and the shadow as two dancers circling each other endlessly. The goal is not to destroy the dance, but to remain aware of it, to know who leads, who follows, when they change places. The smile, in this metaphor, is the gesture of grace that keeps the dance human. When it becomes rigid, the dance dies. In mythic terms, this vigilance is the eternal return of the hero to the underworld. Orpheus must always look back. The Buddha must keep meditating. Christ must carry the wounds even after resurrection. The danger is not in falling again, but in believing one is beyond falling. Jung saw enlightenment not as a peak, but as a spiral, a path that returns to the same lessons until humility becomes instinct. And so, the final warning is simple but merciless. Beware the new smile that believes itself eternal. Every truth can become poison when worshipped. Every light can blind when unexamined. The authentic smile, if clutched too tightly, will rot into performance again. The only safety is movement, the willingness to keep descending, keep questioning, keep dying to illusion. In the end, Jung's teaching about the smile was never about expression, but about awareness. The false smile hides the shadow. The authentic smile integrates, but even that must be held lightly, a flame cupped in trembling hand. The moment one believes the flame belongs to them, it extinguishes. And so, as the final echo of his philosophy, Jung might whisper, "Do not trust the smile that never fades. Even the sun must set to rise again, because consciousness, like light, is only sacred when it remembers the dark." The danger was never in smiling, it was in forgetting why we do.